I was sitting in the hospital hallway, listening to the steady rhythm of the ventilator behind the glass door, where my wife lay motionless. Then I heard my daughter-in-law's voice from the on-call room next door. Cold, rushed. She's not going to wake up anyway. Her kidney is the last chance for my child. I froze. The woman fighting for her last breath was my wife, and the person who said those words was someone I once called family. Before I go on, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening to this story from. Now, sit with me for a moment, because what I'm about to say next is what started tearing my family apart that very night. After those words, the hospital hallway suddenly felt longer than it should have. The cold white fluorescent lights reflected off the tiled floor, making everything look flat and frighteningly still. I didn't take another step. I didn't turn around and leave either. I stood there, frozen, as if any movement would cause the truth I had just heard to shatter and spill at my feet. I've lived long enough to know that some moments don't allow immediate reactions. If you react, you're wrong. If you speak, you lose everything. I leaned my back against the cold wall, my hand gripping the small box I had brought from home. Inside were a few old photos of Nancy, the safe key she always kept with her, and a small note she had written in a hurry before leaving the house the day the accident happened. I had never opened it, and at that moment, I didn't have the courage to. The door to the on-call room was slightly open. I heard Kevin, my son, saying something under his breath. His voice was uncertain. He sounded like a child backed into a corner, not brave enough to object and not clean enough to refuse. Stephanie answered quickly, clearly, like someone who had rehearsed every line. She talked about time, about opportunity, about how everything was already locked in within the system. Not a single word about Nancy as a human being, just a file, a backup resource. I realized I was shaking, not from fear, but from a contradiction too obvious to ignore. The woman who had lived with me for more than 40 years, the woman who was careful with every signature, every piece of paper, was now being labeled as having consented to a decision she had never discussed with me. Nancy never liked hospitals. She trusted cold procedures even less. She once told me that if one day she was no longer conscious, things should be left to nature. No intervention, no exploitation. No one had the right to decide for her. I walked slowly toward the emergency room door. Through the thick glass, I saw Nancy lying there, motionless, her face pale yet strangely peaceful. The machines around her made steady sounds like an emotionless countdown. I wondered, if she could hear any of this, what would she think, knowing that her own son was staying silent? A nurse walked past and nodded at me. Her eyes carried the familiar sympathy I had seen all day. I nodded back slowly. No one knew that just a few steps away, a decision was being discussed as casually as scheduling a meeting. I returned to the long bench where I had been sitting for hours. Outside the thick glass, the night was heavy with snow. The wind slammed against the surrounding buildings, producing low, hollow sounds, like a warning. Chicago winters are always harsh, but that night the cold seemed to crawl straight into my chest. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the past few days. 5 days before the accident, Nancy had mentioned Kevin. She didn't go into detail. She only said our son was under financial pressure. I was used to that. Kevin had always tried to build things bigger than he could carry. But that time, Nancy looked at me for a long moment, as if she wanted to say more, then stopped. I didn't ask. I thought some things were for children to face on their own. Now, I understand that my silence back then may have opened the door to today. A doctor stepped out of the emergency room and told me in a flat voice that Nancy's condition showed no significant change. I nodded, thanked him. I didn't ask anything else. I was beginning to see how easily information could be bent, depending on who was allowed to speak it. I checked the clock. It was close to midnight. Christmas was only a few hours away. Out there, people were preparing warm dinners, carefully wrapped gifts, and here I was, sitting in a cold hallway, realizing that my family might be standing on completely opposite sides of an invisible line. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call Stephanie's name. I didn't ask Kevin why he stayed silent. I made one very simple decision. If they believed I was just a broken old father, then I would let them believe it. I had been retired for many years, but I had never forgotten how to observe, how to wait, and how to let the truth reveal itself. I placed the keepsake box on my lap and opened it for the first time. Nancy's note held only one short sentence in her familiar handwriting. If anything happens, trust what you see, not what people tell you. I folded the paper and slipped it into my inner pocket. In that moment, I knew the night would not end in silence. But to break it, I would need time. And I was ready to wait. I didn't leave the hospital that night. I stayed right where I was until the sky outside the glass shifted from black to a pale gray. When Stephanie and Kevin stepped out of the on-call room early that morning, my head was lowered, both hands resting on my cane. Looking exactly like an old man worn down after a sleepless night. Stephanie glanced at me just long enough to be sure I hadn't heard anything. Then she turned away. Kevin avoided my eyes. His silence confirmed everything I needed to know. That was when I understood. From this point on, every move I made had to be calculated. Not to confront them, but to make sure I wasn't pushed out of a game they believed they were controlling. I allowed myself to appear slow. I asked unnecessary questions. I thanked the doctors more than needed. I let everyone believe I was clinging to a fragile hope that my wife would wake up. Meanwhile, I made phone calls. The first person I contacted was Martin, an old friend who used to work as an inspector. We hadn't spoken in years, but he didn't ask why. He simply listened, as I said I needed him to look into an accident. Then he replied, short and direct, "Send me everything you have." I didn't have much, but I had my memory, and I had time. The second call was to Ethan, a tech specialist. Nancy had once helped when he was just starting out. I didn't mention my suspicions. I asked only one question. If data is deleted, does it really disappear? Ethan was quiet for a few seconds, then said, "Only if the person deleting it truly knows what they're doing." That answer brought back a detail I had overlooked. Nancy's car was always set to sync data to her personal account. She was careful. More careful than me sometimes. If someone thought deleting data from a device was enough, then they had underestimated her. Over the next hours, I moved slowly between the hospital and the small nearby apartment. I let Stephanie see me signing papers I hadn't read closely. I let her believe I had accepted reality. But every night when things settled down, I opened Nancy's old laptop. I entered the passwords I knew. Not out of curiosity, but because I had lived with her long enough to know where she hid things. Ethan called me back on the second day. His voice dropped as he said he'd found a backup from the dash camera automatically saved to the cloud. The footage wasn't clear, but it was enough. Another car forced Nancy out of her lane in bad weather. No direct collision, but intention. I didn't feel the anger I expected. I only felt cold. The kind of cold that comes when you finally understand that accidents don't always come from chance. Around the same time, Martin sent me a thin file. Inside was an insurance policy, signed exactly 1 month earlier. The insured was Nancy. The beneficiary was Kevin. The payout was large enough to erase every debt he was carrying. I stared at the signature for a long time. It looked like Nancy's, but not entirely. Something about it felt rushed. Something that didn't belong to her. I remembered our last conversation before Nancy left the house that day. She said Kevin wanted to sell the family home. I brushed it off. I thought it was temporary pressure. I didn't realize that in some minds, assets aren't just solutions. They're motives. Stephanie began to change her behavior. She spoke to me more. Her voice softened. She called me Dad. She mentioned Leo, the child who was waiting for a miracle. I listened. I nodded. I let every sentence hang itself on an invisible thread. One thing stood out. All information about Nancy's condition passed through Stephanie before reaching me. She explained everything with expertise, with terms I didn't challenge. But I noticed a troubling pattern. No change. No signal. Prepare yourself. The same phrases repeated like a pre-recorded message. So I called our family's private doctor, the man who had followed Nancy's health for years. I didn't ask him to break any rules. I simply asked him to visit my wife as a private individual. No files, no notice. After seeing Nancy, he called me. His voice lowered. "Donald, something isn't right. Her condition doesn't match what they're describing." That didn't surprise me, but it confirmed that I wasn't alone in what I was seeing. I began connecting the pieces. An accident arranged carefully enough to avoid attention. A rushed insurance contract. An organ donation file quietly closed in the system. A son silenced by debt. A daughter-in-law who understood hospital systems too well. Nothing loud. Nothing chaotic. Just a sequence of cold decisions. That evening I returned to the same hallway, the same bench where I had read Nancy's note. I watched the snow fall outside and thought of one simple truth. If I stayed silent, everything would unfold exactly as they planned. And by the time the truth surfaced, it might be too late. I had no intention of using money to buy silence or apply pressure. I didn't want to destroy anyone with my own hands. I only wanted the light turned on at the right moment. And to do that, I needed to turn their confidence into their greatest mistake. I didn't rush. When someone believes they've controlled everything, they start walking faster, straight toward their mistake. Stephanie was in that exact state. She began talking about final steps with a sense of relief, as if everything left was just procedure. Kevin was different. He spoke less. His eyes never settled. But that hesitation only made him cling tighter to the wife he believed was leading the way. I chose to appear at the right moment and in the right role. I told Kevin I was tired, that I no longer had the strength to keep waiting. I mentioned my age. I said Nancy wouldn't want this meaningless silence to drag on. I spoke slowly, evenly, letting every word sound like surrender. Kevin exhaled. He didn't look at me for long. He was afraid of seeing something he didn't want to face. Stephanie was different. She looked at me the way someone inspects an item that's almost theirs. There was no joy in her eyes, only confirmation. When I suggested holding a small farewell and prayer gathering for Nancy, right in the hospital lobby, she nodded almost immediately. I said I wanted it before signing the final papers. I wanted to say thank you. I wanted peace. Stephanie smiled, the smile of someone who had been waiting for the right signal. I informed hospital management with a very safe reason. I wanted to announce a charitable donation to the Patient Assistance Fund, in the spirit of Christmas. No one refused. Northwestern Memorial was used to announcements like that. I chose an evening time slot, formal enough, not too late. I requested access to the large display screens in the main lobby to present transparent information. Everything sounded reasonable. Meanwhile, my network began to close in. Martin helped me contact the people who needed to be present if things unfolded as I expected. No one came for promises. They came for evidence. Ethan worked more quietly. He set up an independent projection system separate from the hospital servers. Once activated, it would broadcast simultaneously on public screens and on several Chicago business channels I had access to. I didn't need millions watching. I only needed the right people. I told neither Stephanie nor Kevin about any of it. I continued playing the role of a father who had run out of hope. I asked doctors about the procedures required to close out treatment. I signed papers I knew didn't take effect immediately. I let Stephanie believe time was on her side. The night before the gathering, I sat alone in the apartment listening to the wind slip through the window frames. I thought about Nancy, about the years we spent building everything from nothing. She always believed that truth, if held long enough, would find its own way out. I wondered if she would forgive me for not seeing things sooner. I didn't look for an answer. I only knew I couldn't turn back. The next morning, Stephanie told me the team preparing for the transplant would be ready in the early hours of the following day. She spoke softly, like a family secret. I nodded. I said the gathering that evening would help me feel at peace before signing. She placed a hand on my shoulder, a calculated gesture. I didn't push it away. I let it remain as part of the performance. The evening arrived faster than I expected. The hospital lobby was neatly arranged, the lighting softer than usual. A few reporters appeared just as I had predicted. Hospital leadership stood in line, polite and cautious. Kevin wore a dark suit, his face tight. Stephanie stood beside him, calm to the point of being unsettling. I stepped forward, leaning on my cane, each step slow. I could feel the eyes on me, some curious, some sympathetic. No one suspected that this old man was carrying more than farewell words. I began speaking about Nancy. Not long, not poetic. I talked about a woman who valued order, believed in responsibility, and was careful with decisions that affected others. I said she taught me one thing above all: never let silence be used against you. Stephanie remained still. Kevin swallowed. I signaled the technician. The screen behind me lit up, but nothing played yet. I turned to Kevin and gave him one last chance. I asked very gently if he had anything he wanted to say to his mother. Kevin opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Stephanie, just for a second. But that second was long enough for me to know he had chosen. I nodded, not to Kevin, to myself. I pressed the button. In that moment, I was no longer a broken old father. I was simply a husband doing what needed to be done. And I knew that from this second on, every exit they believed they had was already closed. The first sound that filled the lobby wasn't a voice, but a heavy silence. The images on the large screen didn't move right away. Just a frozen frame, a timestamp, a login account name, and a small line confirming that an action had been executed within the internal system. I saw Stephanie tilt her head slightly, as if making sure she was seeing it correctly. Kevin went rigid, his hands clenched tight. Then a familiar voice came through. Not loud, not sharp, just clear enough for the entire lobby to hear. It was Stephanie, speaking in what she believed was a private exchange. She mentioned the right timing, that everything had been prepared, that Nancy was no longer capable of responding. No single word crossed a legal line, but every sentence fell perfectly into place, like pieces of a puzzle that could no longer be denied. I didn't look at the screen. I watched the people standing in front of me. A few hospital executives began exchanging glances. One reporter lowered their head, writing quickly. Stephanie stepped back half a pace. Kevin turned toward me, his lips trembling, but no sound came out. I thought of the moment earlier, when I had given him one last chance. He had missed it. The audio shifted to the next clip. Another recording. Shorter, clearer. This time Stephanie spoke about the collision on the snowy night. No details, just enough to understand that it hadn't been entirely accidental. I heard a sharp breath somewhere in the crowd. No one stood still anymore. I raised my hand to signal a stop. The screen went dark. I turned back to the room, my voice steady, slow, just as it had been all evening. I said I had no intention of turning this place into a courtroom. I only wanted the truth to be seen before any doors were closed. I reminded them that Nancy had never agreed to let anyone decide in her place, and that, in a family silence in the face of wrongdoing, is also a choice. Stephanie tried to regain control of her voice. She said it was a misunderstanding, that the recordings had been edited, that I was reacting under emotional distress. She spoke fast, too fast. I didn't respond. I simply stood there, letting her speed expose her panic. That was when the phone in my jacket pocket vibrated. I didn't take it out right away. I waited until Stephanie stopped speaking, until the room fell into an uneasy void. Then I looked down at the screen. A short message. No explanation. Nancy is awake. She's asking for you. In that moment, every sound around me seemed to pull away. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel joy the way people imagine it. I felt one thing clearly. The plan to keep Nancy silent had failed. I looked up. I told everyone that before anything continued, they needed to know one more truth. I said Nancy's condition was not what had been reported, that there had been interventions preventing her from responding as she should have been able to. I didn't use harsh words. I simply said the truth had been buried beneath layers of very reasonable explanations. A few members of hospital leadership began stepping away from their positions. I saw them speaking quickly among themselves. Stephanie could no longer stand straight. She looked around, searching for something to hold on to. Kevin stepped back again. He shook his head over and over, as if he could undo what was happening. The police arrived quietly. No sirens, no flashing lights, just uniforms entering the lobby with the calm of people who knew exactly why they were there. Martin stood behind them. His eyes met mine for a brief second. I nodded. No words were needed. Stephanie started speaking louder. She demanded to know who had authorized this. She ordered the broadcast to stop. No one answered her. Kevin sat down on a chair, his face buried in his hands. I didn't move closer. I didn't need to witness my son's collapse from a shorter distance. An officer approached and spoke briefly with Stephanie. She reacted sharply, but every movement was quickly contained. There was no chaos, no struggle, just a series of decisive actions, the way things should have happened from the beginning. I was guided to the side. A hospital administrator apologized to me in a very low voice. I listened, but I didn't respond. I asked only one question. Where is my wife? They led me down a different hallway, quieter. The snow was still falling outside, but I no longer noticed it. When I stepped into the room, Nancy's eyes were open. They were weak, but alert. She looked at me for a long time, as if making sure I was really there. I took her hand, the familiar hand, warmer than I expected. She didn't speak right away. She simply squeezed back. A small confirmation. I leaned down and spoke very softly. I told her everything had been brought into the light, that she didn't have to stay silent anymore. Nancy blinked once. Slowly, I knew she had heard me, and that was enough. Outside that room, I knew Christmas night had not unfolded the way anyone expected. But inside that small space, for the first time in days, I felt dawn was very close. The days that followed moved more slowly than I expected. There was no longer the haunting rhythm of machines in the hallway. No more whispered conversations behind half-closed doors. Everything shifted into a different state. Quiet, but clear. Once the truth is brought into the light, it doesn't need to be spoken loudly anymore. It stands on its own. Nancy recovered day by day. She didn't remember every detail from the time she was kept in silence, but she remembered the feeling of being unable to speak. When she talked about it, her voice was calm. No resentment, no trembling, just a clear acknowledgement that certain boundaries had been crossed. I sat by her bed listening and realized that her greatest strength had never been physical. Kevin and Stephanie no longer appeared at the hospital. I heard about everything through very official channels. No extra explanations were needed. What they had done was no longer a family matter. It had become a responsibility to the law and to the public. I didn't follow every development. I didn't need to know how they defended themselves. Some stories, once they've finished their role in your life, don't need to be retold. There was only one thing that stayed on my mind. Leo. That child didn't choose his circumstances. He didn't understand why the adults around him made the decisions they did. When Nancy asked me about him, I didn't avoid the question. I said that no matter what, he still deserved help, to the right way. Nancy nodded. She held my hand gently, as if that decision had been made long ago. A few months later, when everything had settled, I started a small fund. It didn't carry our family name. It wasn't tied to any personal story. It was simply a place to support organ transplant cases handled properly and transparently. Leo was one of the first children added to the list. I didn't meet him again. I didn't need to. Knowing he had a fair chance was enough. The day Nancy was discharged, Chicago welcomed us with a rare sunny morning. Most of the snow had melted. Lake Michigan shimmered under the soft light. I picked her up in our old car, the one we'd driven together for years. No flowers, no congratulations, just a quiet return. We didn't go back to the apartment near the hospital. I took Nancy to the old house, the one we had once considered selling. It was still there, silent, as if it had never been weighed in cold negotiations. Nancy stood on the porch for a long time. She placed her hand on the door frame and took a deep breath. I knew that for her it wasn't just a place. It was confirmation that some things cannot be exchanged. A few days later I burned the old will, not out of anger, not to erase the past. I simply realized that at this age, controlling everything after I'm gone matters less than I once thought. Nancy stood beside me silent. When the paper turned to ash, she said softly that she felt lighter. So did I. We began living more slowly. In the mornings I make coffee. Nancy sits by the window reading the paper. In the afternoons we walk along the lake, speaking very little. Some silences are no longer frightening. They don't hide anything. They're simply the presence of two people who've been through enough to stop filling every moment. Sometimes I think about that snowy night, about the hospital hallway, about the keepsake box, about the note Nancy left behind. If I hadn't heard that sentence, if I had walked away a few steps earlier, if I had chosen to believe the familiar reassurances, maybe everything would have gone another way. But life doesn't run on hypotheticals. It runs on choices made when there's no way back. I don't see what I did as a victory. I see it as what needed to be done. Family, I learned this too late, isn't about blood at any cost. Family is about respecting boundaries, even when no one is watching. One morning, standing by Lake Michigan, Nancy took my hand. The wind was gentle, the water calm. She said she wasn't afraid anymore. Not because everything was perfectly safe, but because she knew the truth, even when delayed, still finds a way to speak. I looked out at the water, thought about everything we'd been through, and understood this justice doesn't need to be loud. It only needs someone patient enough to wait, and brave enough not to turn away when the truth whispers close by. This story ends here. Please subscribe to the channel, like and share, so that quiet, honest, and human stories can continue to reach others. Thank you for staying until the very end. The lesson that remains is simple and clear. The truth can be hidden, but it cannot be replaced. Family is not the place where silence protects wrongdoing. It's the place where someone knows when to stop, to preserve their conscience. I wish you a peaceful night